Hi, everyone. How are you all doing today? It is another gray Sunday here. I hope you guys are having a great weekend. I think gray days are the best to do editing and writing on. I actually love gray days. Today's topic is going to be this is actually a suggested one from JB Taylor. His link is down below if you want to watch his YouTube channel. He does reviews of different movies and books and stuff like that. So what I want to talk about today is something that he suggested, which is how to set up and continue a scene in historical fiction, keeping it in the historical time period, keeping it historically accurate, stuff like that. And I thought that was a really great idea. So first of all, in case you guys, I don't know how many of you follow me on Instagram, but I'm really excited because I just got this in the mail, which is going to have to do with my next Dark Victoriana book, book 3. So this is Alan Pinkerton, and on Instagram, I said I was so excited to finally find this book at the library, and now I have it, like that I get to keep it, and I'm very excited because it has so much good information on it. And that's one of the things about historical fiction, you know, you want to buy like all the books. This one happened to be 86 cents for a brand new copy. Wow. So I'm all excited about that. So anyway, I have like a list of things that I want to mention to you guys. So if you see me looking over here, that's just my little list so I don't miss anything that I want to tell you about. So first of all, how do we start writing the scene? Some people definitely have trouble getting started, especially because it's historical. And that can sound a little bit more intimidating than it actually is. So there are two ways that you can do this. You can write the scene right off the bat in historical fiction mode. And the other way is you can just write creatively and go back and fix the historical accuracy. So either way, let me just say, it doesn't matter how you do it. Happy Sunday. Hi, Joshua, Amber, Joe, Anita. Thank you guys so much for coming. Either way you do it, for me, I've done it both ways. And either way, I end up always finding something historical that I missed. And that's the importance of going over and over it again, even after, you know, maybe you write the first draft, but really like picking apart everything you can to figure out like what requires more research, what you may have written in a modern way or based on assumption. Like we watch these period dramas like Downton Abbey and we make a lot of assumptions, and, you know, there are a lot of things to consider with that. Like the fact that Downton Abbey stars a lot of wealthy characters, and when you see their dress, you may assume that, you know, you could use that for a middle class character, and that may not really be the case. So there are a lot of details there. Anyway, going back to how to start a scene, if you want to start writing it in a historically accurate way, one great way to go about this, I'm doing this for my third book, is you want to research the time period as a whole. And that can be you have like a starting point, basically what you want to write about. You start researching that. You start noticing things that interest you. You go off on tangents. This is where tangents are a good thing. Rabbit holes are a really good thing. And you start learning so much more about the time period in a different level of depth. Or even if you see it on like a surface level, you have kind of a better idea of where you're starting. You get a feel for like, what was the time period like? What is someone in that time period seeing, feeling, that kind of stuff? And so that way you may be able to start it, set it up immediately in a historical way. So in terms of the language, I find that to be the last thing that I'm going to work on. You know, that's one of the hardest parts. So I write that a lot of times a little bit more modern with fewer contractions, for example, but on the more modern side, using modern phrases. And then along the way, I'm going to start replacing those. But I need to get that idea down. So for me, it's kind of a mix of setting it up already historically accurate, because I've done a bunch of research, but also doing it creatively and not worrying too much about the words until later. So again, like it really depends on how you feel about it, but just make sure you go back and you're checking on the things that I'm about to tell you in order to keep it feeling in that time period and historically accurate. So one of the things is, I wanted to give you an example. I want to give you a couple of interesting examples of it doesn't matter how you start, you're going to end up with things that you accidentally put in a different time period or incorrectly. So one example that I use in many of my videos is actually, there's a scene in Anatomy of a Darkened Heart where candlelight matters. This, Elizabeth, the mother, is going downstairs and she's using candlelight. And that was originally what I thought they would be using for the time period. Keep in mind, if you're in the 19th century, things moved very fast. There were a lot of changes. So you know, 1840s to 1850s, things were different. So, you know, I just put in candlelight because I thought that's what it was. And then something happens in that scene where it matters. She drops the candle, and how that plays out, her trying to put it out and all that, it had to be changed when I did more research and realized it was gaslight at that time. And, you know, dropping like something that has gas in it, you know, the liquid, the oil, and having the fire there could cause a fire to spread way more rapidly than a candle. So I had to be super careful with that and actually change like a number of things in that scene to make it more accurate. It also affected the lighting in the entire book. So that's like one of those places where you can figure it out afterwards, but it can affect the rest of the story once you realize your mistake. And I also had that happen to me with fingerprinting in Lock and Key, which is something that JB Taylor actually recently mentioned in his review of The Lodger, which is an amazing film from, I believe it's the 1940s. I'm sorry if I made a mistake with that. But anyway, it is George Sanders and Laird Krieger. Great movie. He reviewed it and said that they didn't actually have fingerprints at the time. And that is true. So that was like a liberty they took that happened a lot in old movies. In Lock and Key, I have a scene that I mentioned fingerprints in, and the context is super important because, you know, Mr. Locke is talking to one of his employees, and he mentions the police, in the original version, mentions the police realizing, he mentions that the police are starting to use fingerprints. And so he has some advice from there on out. I'm not going to spoil it. But anyway, I realized that fingerprints were not actually a thing then, but we, as like my generation and younger probably, we're all raised watching like Law and Order and CSI, where fingerprints are like the first thing everybody looks for, and you don't really think about it. It's just in your brain, and it's always been that way. So when I finally thought to check, it took me a while to even think to check. I discovered that fingerprints were not a thing yet. They were, they had discovered that you could identify by fingerprints, but they didn't get it. They thought that there were 7 types of fingerprints, or it was like 9 first and then 7. And then later they discovered that each person has a very specific fingerprint. So I couldn't use that. And it actually changed the entire scene, and it was painful to rewrite. It really, I'm telling you, it was a hard one. It took several tries to come up with something that would be similar, because the character development there was super important and I couldn't lose the scene. So I had to make a major change. I'm going to go over to the comments now before I move on to the next point. And Joshua is saying, such great advice. I have one historical fiction that I started on about 10K into it. I kept getting hung up on the facts and would spend hours researching instead of writing. Yeah. That can be a problem. Absolutely, that can be a problem. And I think a lot of people struggle with that. I do that, and I go down those rabbit holes when I'm in the middle of a creative scene, and then I forget what I was doing. So that doesn't help. It's not good. You have to like stay on track when you go to do that kind of stuff. Amber is saying, I remember Joseph Murphy saying he wrote something like 7 volumes of background research notes before writing his first book. Yes. And that is fantasy. But he came up with the world. He came up with the characters. He came up with so many details to the world that he had all that research. That's his own development written down. And then he would, of course, like you say, Amber, he would probably have to go back and refer to that a lot. Joshua says, I get hung up on facts even when writing fantasy. Yeah. As a reader, I have issues. If something doesn't make sense, it completely halts my reading. Yeah, it totally gets in the way. It definitely gets in the way. Hi, JB. Glad you were able to make it. JB, if you missed the first part, I think that's going to help you doing your setup. And I gave a couple of examples. And I mentioned one of your videos. Okay, so let me move on to the next point, which is the language and phrasing. Now, this is a big thing. I feel that I did a better job in Lock and Key than I did in Anatomy. Anatomy was my first book. I worked really hard to try to keep the language right. But at the same time, when you write historical fiction, you have to make a decision. Are you going to write in a more modern tone that modern people will be able to read faster? Or are you going to write in like a Jane Austen-like tone that may slow people down and may not be quite as popular, but is accurate? Now, I think there's a good balance between these two things. I think you can always balance between these two things. And you can work to make it sound like that period by focusing on the phrases you use. Excuse me. You can focus on the phrases you use, the words you use, and just the way things are put forward by your characters, the way narration is done. I have an 1850s dictionary, and I refer to that because there are some words that were not in existence yet, and there are some words that were used completely differently. For example, so like I said, write your book and then go back and check the words, because that will stop you in your tracks and really distract you. But I went to write that someone jogged over to someone else. And then I thought, jog, that sounds like a really new word. I looked it up. Okay, it existed in the 1850s dictionary, but it didn't mean the same thing. It was something totally different. And I can't remember what it was, but it was unrelated to actually jogging. So I had to change that word because I felt that it was not authentic. So some people aren't going to go quite that far, but to me, it's worth it. It just feels right. And then the other thing is phrases. We're used to a lot of phrases that just didn't exist back in that time. And to keep it more authentic, you can definitely do the research to see when did this phrase, like the etymology, when did this phrase come into being? Sometimes, this is a big debate, sometimes there are phrases that sound modern and words that sound modern, but they actually existed back in an older time period and were invented way before you would think. And it's surprising. At that point, and I went to a talk with Shelley Freidont, who is also a historical mystery writer, and she had mentioned the same problem. Do you put that phrase in or that word in because you know it's right, but you also know that people are going to say, this is not, they're going to think it didn't exist in the time period because it sounds too modern. Her publisher told her, do not put something in if you know that people are going to look at it and say, it's too modern, even though you have the facts. She said that she's actually received emails that were complaining about this, emails saying, like, I don't think you did your research. This phrase is too modern. And she would say, right back and say, actually, I did do my research, and get into a thing unintentionally with a reader, which is something you want to avoid, of course. You don't really want to be going back and forth in some kind of argument with one of your readers. So that can be a tricky one, but that's what makes it worth doing the research on these phrases and these words so that you don't confuse people. And also, okay, this sounds modern. I'm going to cut it out even though it existed in the 19th century. Joshua says there is a real talent in using the five senses with the characters blended with the language, and you can give the ambiance of the time period without giving every detail. Absolutely, those are the small details that really count and put you right in that time period without having to go into a whole spiel, a whole description, taking the reader out. I totally agree with that. It's so important. So the next one on my list is looking up big things that you may not have thought about. This is what I'm talking about with the fingerprints, where that's a really big deal. Fingerprints are a big deal, but it's hard to think of that stuff when you're like raised on these shows that, constantly mention fingerprints. So to you, or to me rather, it's just in my brain always as like, this has always existed. And yet, of course, it hasn't. So you have to think way outside of what we're used to. Another example of that is in Lock and Key. I had to do research on the difference between constables, detectives. I wrote down my list here: constable, detectives, police, and coroners. Believe it or not, there was a huge difference between what those people did in the time. So if I wanted to be historically accurate, I've got to do that research. So when I looked it up, I found that coroners did a lot of the detective work, which is no longer done. Like, they would go out to a house and start asking questions. So that makes a big difference to the historical accuracy. So what I'm saying to you is, you may think you know something, you may think you're sure of it, but always check, always make sure, because you'd be surprised what you find. I also always thought, I was always under the impression that in the 1850s and just generally in the 19th century, men always wore beards. They had some of them had these crazy mutton chops. Some of them had it was specific types of styles, but always facial hair. And when I went to write Lock and Key, it was important that Mr. Locke differentiate himself from his, visually, from his employees. And so in the original version, I had him telling his employees to shave, and it was supposed to be him forcing them to have a more childlike appearance, where he would have the beard and look like more of the adult, the master, the parent. So that was a psychological thing with him. When I did research, I found that actually in the time period I was writing, men were not wearing beards. It ruined everything I was doing. And so that was really tough. I had to change it. I had to change how he said it and what the interpretation was of his employees. Joshua says, question, is it sometimes okay to use modern language as like a jab at the reader, almost facetiously? It shows the narrator is making a joke for the reader without breaking into a narrator voice. I would say to that, it really depends on what you're doing. I would say it really depends on the flow of your book and what you're trying to accomplish. So in my books, for example, I break the advice that a lot of people give saying, you have to have comedy in there. And I have no comedy at all. It's just straight darkness and that's it. So for me to put in something like that would not work. But I have seen where it does work. And Joshua, in your novels, I think it does work. It actually, in my opinion, it adds a layer of fun to it. And that's intentional. Like I can tell as a reader that is intentional. It's not that you are getting the time period wrong. It's that you're doing it intentionally. And I think that readers can tell the difference. So I think it depends on what your goals are and what you're trying to get across, like the mood, the ambiance, everything you're trying to get across. Let's see. Joshua also says, of course, I suppose that the time, the written work, and it would lose meaning after a few decades. It does depend on the time, definitely. But like I said, reading your works for me, Joe, I can't read that out loud, but it's a good point. Yeah. JB says, what are your thoughts on what we now deem vulgar language that was used back then? Words like retard, the N-word, and other words like that. That's a tough one. That's a really good question. It's really tough because there's a huge debate about the N-word now and whether it should be used at all by anybody, whether it should be struck from the classroom, classroom usage. Like you read Mark Twain, it has that word. Do you speak it when you're discussing this? It's really difficult. Those books sometimes get banned for their language. Well, that wasn't language in the time. So that's a tough one, JB, especially with words that can be offensive to an entire race. And actually, to me, like if I was going to write something that could include the N-word because it was historically accurate, I would probably search out some people of that particular race and say to them, how would you feel about this? I am a Caucasian author. I'm writing in this time period. This is the reality of the speech. What do you think? Is that appropriate? Or would you automatically think this is the wrong thing to do? I would probably do that kind of research, where I'm literally asking people, give me your opinion on this before I go putting that out there. And there are definitely huge authors that can get away with that stuff with no problem. And then there are authors that are going to get attacked for it. And I don't know if you can really blame anyone for attacking for it. It really depends. So like I said, I would do actual like talking to people and seeing what they would say. And then, yeah, language that was used back then. There's also, of course, words that are, there are also words that were used back then that were not a big deal now. And it's kind of, that can be fun. That can be like, you say a word, I can't think of one off the top of my head, but one that was a big deal then that was really like raunchy back then. It means nothing now. Like, for example, this is really funny. I don't know if you guys know this, but back during the maybe I don't know if it was 30s, the word saying "God damn it" was like a huge big deal. And it was like, I watched this black and white movie reel of all the mistakes people were making, all the outtakes. It was outtakes. And so nowadays, when you watch outtakes and somebody says a word they shouldn't, it's usually pretty, severe. You can't say it unless you have a certain rating for your movie. Back then, they all said, "God damn it." And it was like the worst thing. It was like horrible. But now it's not a big deal. So, putting that in a historical context and having another character react can be super entertaining and very interesting, in my opinion. So that's the type of thing I would encourage you, if it fits, yeah, definitely do it, but have somebody react so that we know that, like, not everybody's going to realize it was such a bad word back then or something like that. Let's see. Joshua says, I love how much you love that line. This is what Joe just said. I think it should be voted into best fantasy opening lines. I'm not biased at all. Christy mentioned, Joe says, Christy mentioned how Josh was good at using language, tongue in cheek, and it works. I was citing an example. Yeah, it does. It can definitely works. You're a miss. Something like, yeah, something is a miss and the other character says you're a miss. It is like a modern insult. Yeah, I think that that's fine. I think that that can work really, really well, especially that kind of thing is kind of perfect because it's not too far into this time period. So I think that that kind of a thing can work well, Joshua. Okay, my next one was looking up the little details, and that adds historical depth. And so what I wanted to mention was about, this is a mistake I see in a lot of historical works, which is why I want to mention it. And I have an example here. When you're talking about the way a house looks, like a character walks into a room and says that they are, you know, sitting on this big fluffy armchair or something like that. I don't know, something along those lines. And it was brown. I don't know. One mistake a lot of authors, historical authors, can make is not actually looking up whether that was a thing. So and you can't rely on other books because they may or may not be sort of stretching what was around back then. And so if you describe a room in a way that didn't exist back then, that's immediate historical inaccuracy. And while not everybody's going to catch it, some people are definitely going to catch it. But the other thing is, even if people don't catch it, if you're going through the trouble to describe something like to a T, and I'm not saying wasting like paragraphs on this, I'm saying using words very carefully so that you really achieve something that really gives the ambiance of the time period. Like, for example, there was a time period when carpets were only used by the rich. And so this is in Lock and Key also. Carpets were used by the rich and they were something that not everybody could afford. And so when John is at Mr. Locke's house, for example, he notices that there's carpeting and he's like, wow, you know, this is a big deal. I can't believe this. I've never been in such luxury. Like, that's a detail, you know, that's a tiny detail, but it's a detail to sort of give you a feel for the time period. So I want to recommend something to you guys if you're interested in that level. And that can also be like, he looked at the mahogany furniture, which was also very rich. You know, did they use mahogany back then? What was used back then? And also, what is the difference between what a wealthy person used and what a middle-class person used and what a poorer person is going to use? That's a lot of times people miss that kind of stuff too. So as you can tell, I really love details. I love researching details. So anyway, I have this book that I use a lot. This is Victorian interior design, and it does go from 1830 to 1900. It has been invaluable to me. So I start my research here. I have a room and I say, okay, I want it to be wealthy. I want it to be shocking to this other person who's always been poor. And I need to see, what does that look like? First of all, I'm the type of person who has blueprints of houses from back then, like literally in my notebook. I keep those kinds of things. Because it's important to me for the layout to also be realistic. I am the type of person who looks up, did they have wardrobes? What did they call it? What did they literally hang in it? I'm not going to make assumptions. I am also the type of person who, if you know, we have someone, even a servant or something, scrubbing the floor, what were they using and what kind of brush? Like, you know, you can't make an assumption that there were sponges, of course. You know, there may have been brushes. Was it a soft bristle? Was it a hard bristle? Could it damage the wood? You know, I go into that level of detail. Not everybody's going to, but if you want it to be like really super accurate, throwing those details in, I've actually had reviewers say, wow, this was so well researched. Wow, I felt like I was on the time period. There was stuff I didn't know. And that really excites me, that kind of stuff. I think that to me, makes a difference to how it really, you keep a scene in that time period really well, down to the tiniest details. I'm just reading the comments. JB is saying, I think the reader is willing to give the writer a break with slips, but if modern words consistently find their way in, they get annoyed. True. If you have like, they're constantly sounding like today, then that's a problem. You know, there are a lot of mistakes, as I'm sure a lot of you know, with people writing in the 1980s and then putting in like these modern normal cell phones, which is not a thing. So, I mean, you want to be careful with that kind of stuff. That kind of stuff you don't get a slip on. But, you know, yeah, I would agree on the words. Not everybody's going to be so detailed. It is hard. It is hard. And you miss things very easily. So Joshua says, and then everyone carpeted their walls in the 70s. That's great. Amber says, haha, that's just because they kept losing their balance in the 60s and 70s. Joshua says, we need a book where someone is shot in is shot into the 70s and thinks everyone is rolling in the green because their walls are carpeted. Amber saying, I find research fascinating too. I know you do. Amber's really good at research. Okay. I love details and the new info I uncover. Yeah, it's fascinating. The problem is that one interesting fact leads to another and another, and soon I've spent hours on stuff not even related. Yeah, that's exactly right. I think we all can relate to that. And that's where if you don't write down what you were thinking, like just finish your thought, even if you write it badly, you can end up just totally forgetting what the point of your research even was. Why was I looking this up? I don't know. I hate that. And then a final one is the etiquette and mannerisms of the time, which of course, Victorian era, like, wow. Okay. There's a lot in there. And all that research adds up to 1 or 2 lines in the entire book. Joshua is saying, that's right. Exactly. Joshua, I have researched rooms to a degree and words to a degree that it is literally, like you say, like one word. And to me, it makes a difference. I don't know how many people notice, but anyway, it makes a difference to me, at least. I'm happy with it. But the etiquette, like, for example, in the 19th century is really important. You have somebody walk into a room. You have somebody walking into a house. Etiquette, like immediately. Do they remove their hat? Do they remove their gloves? Is there a maid to take them? If they stormed into the room because they're angry, maybe they didn't have time. The maid is chasing after them. The butler is chasing after them. The difference between a butler and a maid, when you were rich, you had a butler. When you were not quite as rich, you had a maid. But anyway, like that kind of stuff, it does make a difference. And especially anybody who's familiar with the 19th century is going to know if you did that research. There are a lot of very specific things having to do with the order you do things in, how you go over someone's house, how you got invited, how does all this work? It's really, really, really important and makes a huge difference. And some time periods don't have as much of that, but some like the 19th century, whoa, you better be careful, Okay, look at the comments again. I have 2 more books to just share with you, so you see some things that help me that may help you. JB says I'm on a slight delay, so if I say something or ask something that has already been said or ask, sorry. Oh, no problem at all. I'll let you know. Yeah, the Google rabbit hole, Joe. It is so easy. Even in a book, I start reading and I'm so interested. I just keep reading and reading and reading and reading, and then I forget what I was doing. Joshua says, I just finished a 1940s anthropomorphic short story being released in March or April. The research on language and mannerisms was extensive. Took me almost 3 weeks. Yes. I can agree with that completely. When you even watch those movies, you can see the major difference. The way that they acted and the language they use. I completely agree with that. Excuse me. And the slang they use, Joshua, I'm sure you noticed, is like, wow, especially if you look at like noir uses a ton of slang that is kind of hard to think of yourself, and you need to look it up and see what it means. Yeah, I'm going to be interested to read that, Josh. I wanted to share a couple more books with you that may or may not be helpful, but even if it, shows you the kind of things you can look up, these are things I hadn't thought of before I started writing the Dark Victoriana collection. So I have a couple of these books. One is called House and Home, 1850 to 1870, and the other is Healthy Living, 1850 to 1870. These are helping me majorly. Some of the parts in it are clearly, like the introduction is, of course, copyrighted to now, but the rest of it is from A.E. Human's A Dictionary of Everyday Wants, and it's from the time period. And so if you can find stuff from the time period, then you're in like the best shape you can be in. Always use more than one source. Always use multiple sources. And I also wanted to stick in there, don't feel any shame starting with a source that you know is no good. Like if you are lost and can't find what you're looking for, Wikipedia is really good for just like looking up the words, finding the terms you're looking for, and then using that as a jumping off point to find really reliable sources. So that's where I find Wikipedia the most useful. Of course, you can't rely on it 100%, but I have found that when I try to research something and I simply just can't find it, I'm not using the right search terms, I go to Wikipedia, find what I'm supposed to be looking up, and then take that into the rest of my research and find books and websites and stuff. So I wanted to throw that in there. But yeah, this is one of those books that has been really, really valuable. And this is the other one. And they actually have so much detail about the time period because it's from the time period. This was advice to real people of the time. So these have real recipes from the time. The way they wrote it was from the time. The way that you took care of a house was from the time. Let's see, this one has accident prevention, medical treatments, all kinds of stuff that is going to be hard. It's really going to be hard to find. And sometimes when you buy these old books, they come with some interesting things. I found this inside of one of them. I don't know, the Merchant's Almanac of 1622. It's a little thing that, you know, just came in it. This one's interesting. I don't know if this is a book advertisement, but it's Snails, Sex, and Sermons in 1744. That's normal. Sometimes when you buy these old books, people either don't go through them or they just let you have whatever they found in them. One of the other things to keep in mind, sorry for my throat, my goodness. One of the other things to keep in mind is, again, when I said when you're researching clothing, you would be surprised, for example, in the 19th century, the colors that people wore. There were time periods within the 19th century where bright colors were a big thing, and you would never guess that these bright colors were worn and were a big deal. Some patterns you would never guess. But the other thing that I wanted to mention is, like I mentioned before with Downton Abbey, we're looking at a wealthy family. And so if you're writing a middle-class family, those clothes may not have been worn by them. The other thing is, if you're going to use a book like this, which is extremely useful as a jumping off point, it has really gorgeous illustrations. I'll show you one, or pictures rather. You look in this and you say, oh, wow, I'm really set for life. You know, this has like everything you could ever want. It has all the details, amazing pictures. It has descriptions sometimes of what it's made of, what the dress is made of and the color like this. And then you think you're set. But again, I just want to encourage you. There is a difference between what middle-class people wore, lower-class people wore, and wealthy people wore. This dress may be silk, but the dresses that the other women in the middle class wore may not have been silk. That's a part that's like one of those places you can easily get caught on and accidentally put something that doesn't actually apply to the class you're writing for. Okay, I'm going back to the comments. Hey, Rebecca. Let's see. Rianne Johnson's, Brick. Oh, yeah. That's a movie. Took 3 years to write the script because of the noir language and making sure it was authentic and correct. Yes, absolutely. 3 years. That is, I'll tell you, that language is very fascinating. And I'm sure, you know, now, Joshua, you've done all that research. I'm sure you know too. You can have whole sentences in this slang that nobody's going to understand, you know, like nobody would think of. I mean, you can understand it in context, but it's not stuff that you're just going to remember off the top of your head. It's a lot of slang, the way they spoke, the way they acted, very different. Joshua says, after that much time researching, I would decide that is just going to be my niche. Yep. I would always write in that time period, start writing a Netflix television series. You know, Joshua, actually, that's a really good point, because that's what happened to me with the Dark Victoriana collection. It started out as 5 books. It was going to be 2 novels and 3 novelettes was the original plan. Let me tell you, I'm doing all this research. I'm really enjoying it. I'm so into it. I'm loving the time period. I'm loving building everything off the previous book, and yet, you know, having the challenge of making each book a standalone. And I'm finding myself adding more books, more short stories, more everything to it. And I'm sort of thinking this is going to be my niche. I can't even help it. There are other things I want to write. I don't know when that's going to happen. And you know what? I'm not upset about it, because I've put all this time and research into the Victorian era. I feel comfortable. I feel happy with it. So I do 100% agree that that happens when you spend so much time doing all that research. Yeah. Purple is huge, especially in the Victorian era. Yeah. And as you go to different, the tough thing about the Victorian era, like I said, Joe, is things changed real fast. So when I was trying to figure out like mail for that time period, I had to be super careful. Each decade, and sometimes the 5 years, just 5 years would matter. as to, you know, where they were receiving mail and how many times a day. Emerald green, yeah. Joshua says, Mark Twain said, clothes make a man. Naked people have little or no influence on society. That's a good one. I love Mark Twain, by the way. Actually, my nickname in high school was Twain. Mark Twain. Actually, it was just Mark Twain. It was the whole name. Because I really liked Mark Twain and I did a couple of presentations on him. And the tricky part was to work around the N-word because I had to read a lot of quotes. But anyway, he was my favorite author and I was always reading his books. And so somebody in the hallway would be like, Mark Twain, and I would answer. It was funny. Probably applies to storytelling too. Clothes make the story, bring it to life. Absolutely, it does. Amber, that would be a great niche. Christy, because your books are so unique. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And I'm finding that originally when I had the plan and then I started thinking I would go outside of Victorian era, I was like, oh, I can't wait to get there and do new stuff and all that. And then I was just getting so into the time period and getting so into these books that I'm writing that I was like, I don't really want to leave. I'm happy here. Why don't I just say? Thank you, JB. Joe says, that point you made, Josh, that's why Rian Johnson made Looper, to cleanse him of that. Yeah. I feel like, again, I think I said in one other, maybe last week, I had said that one of my goals over time is to do a pen name. So like I might do a pen name where I have lighter works under the pen name, excuse me, where I might do lighter works under the pen name. Or the other thing I thought of afterwards, which hadn't occurred to me before, is I could do stuff outside of the Victorian era under that pen name. I don't know. Something to think about. Joshua, you would have to market to a whole new crowd if you wrote something else, I think. You are the Victorian era writer. You know what? That's exactly, I think the pen name thing is a good idea. And I think that that's exactly like what you're saying, Joshua, is one of my concerns. If I wrote something outside, people would sort of expect something specific. At first, I wanted my name to just be associated with dark fiction. But that was when I was thinking that the Victorian words would be, the Victorian books would end in like 2018, 2019. Now I'm seeing that's not happening. I'm seeing it's going to go on and on. And, you know, maybe what you're saying, I mean, what you're saying is right, Josh. And maybe what I should do is do a pen name for anything not Victorian. And then like if I ever wanted to write something light, you can always do another pen name. I don't mind my name being associated with all those pen names, but the expectations is that's exactly what you're saying is what I was thinking too. I'm glad you said that. Stratus Steampunk. Oh man. All right. Yeah. Well, now that I'm seeing you're excited about this, I'll think about that. That's pretty cool. Maybe that'd be something good for Wattpad. So that it could be under my name, but like on Wattpad, I've posted other things that are still dark, but they're not Victorian. So maybe it could be a Wattpad thing. Well, I hope this helped everyone out there. I hope you guys got something. Oh, you should write as Abigail Whitestone. If you haven't read my book, you have no idea why that's shocking to me. That's a good idea, Joe. Yeah. That would be like a big inside joke between anybody who's read any of the Victoriana collection. And that would be really funny, actually. I hope this was helpful for you guys. GB, I hope this answered your question. I hope seeing some of the resources that I use was helpful. Somebody asked me a question about that on, it was Goodreads, the sources I use and stuff like that. And Goodreads didn't tell me until, and I saw it like 2 years later. So I'm sorry. I'm sorry that I missed that, but you can use this video to see what I refer to. And I hope that you guys, when you go to write historical fiction next, feel a little bit more comfortable now that you have a sort of checklist to go through on what you may want to look up and the detail you may want to go through trying to get and trying to find and how to go about getting those details. So thank you so much for joining me and for spending time with me. I really appreciate it. This was one close to my heart because I have such a good time with it and so much fun. So I'm glad that I'm able to help you guys and hear your thoughts because they really helped me too. So thank you so much. And I will see you next Sunday at 2 p.m. Eastern time for another live stream. Bye.